China and the United States just can't seem to bridge their differences on trade, even though the U.S. seems to be making major headways with Europe and its North American neighbors, Canada and Mexico. Within the next few days, the U.S. is expected to release a final list of another $16 billion of Chinese goods that will be subject to a 25% tariff. And China is expected to retaliate in kind. And currently, there are no official talks underway between the two sides, but scholars and analysts from both sides are communicating and collaborating in research efforts. How will their research influence policy making? And exactly where are we in this trade war? Let's talk to two experts who are now working at think tanks and who know China well. Michael Pillsbury is a senior fellow and director of Chinese strategy at the Hudson Institute. He has worked in the U.S. Congress and the executive branch for every administration since President Richard Nixon. We're also joined by Mr. Wang Huiyao, founder of the Center for China and Globalization, the largest independent global think tank in China. Let me start with you, Mr. Pillsbury, because last time when we were talking to you, you aired your opinions on China-U.S. relations. You said China-U.S. ties will definitely get better in Trump administration. Let's take a listen.
If I see you in 2 or 3 years, I think you'll agree relations under Mr. Trump are better than under Obama and other presidents.
Yes, you were talking to Tian Wei, and you said U.S.-China relations would be better under President Trump. Is it better?
Yes, it's better.
In what way?
The cooperation on North Korea is very impressive. This has not happened with any previous Chinese president and American president. That's the main thing. Secondly, President Trump has not taken any moves on Taiwan. He has not sold a big package of weapons to Taiwan. There's no more telephone calls to Tsai Ing-wen. President Trump has not received the Dalai Lama in the White House. President Trump has not done any really aggressive freedom of navigation operations in South China Sea. So if you look at all the main issues, President Trump has avoided creating trouble in U.S.-China relations. And he has many channels to President Xi Jinping. According to one friend of mine, Xi Jinping, Zhong Shuji, and President Trump have enjoyed more than 30 phone calls to each other, sometimes as long as 1 hour.
But he seems
they have
to
met in person several times.
Big trouble that is looming large. The
Sure
trade war.
Yes.
Could that undermine everything that we've seen over the past 2 years?
Well, yes. If it's a major trade war in which both sides place 10% tariffs on all products, this will slow down the growth rate of both sides, and it will affect global economic growth. So a major trade war obviously would be a disaster. We are moving in that direction, but I don't think the major trade war has begun yet. So if there's a gigantic trade war, you can call me in Washington, D.C., and I will admit to you I was wrong. Relations did not improve between President Trump and President Xi. But I still am very optimistic we can avoid a major trade war. That's one reason why think tanks have to do research on the causes of the situation. As we say, how we got here may have a lot to do with how we can untie the knot.
And Mr. Wang, do you share Mr. Pillsbury's optimism that wouldn't be a major full-blown trade war?
Personally, I actually agree with Mr. Pillsbury that, actually since President Trump came to the office, there was quite a few positive things. North Korea and quite a few things obvious. But of course, this trade friction or trade war that is currently happening is also causing a lot of alarm, as Mike mentioned. I think, but the key is also that probably we need a better communication, we need a better dialogue. That's why CCG, Center for China Globalization, and Hudson Institute, that we are trying to work together, trying to have this joint research project to really review actually the 40 years of U.S.-China relations since they built up the diplomatic ties. It's also the 40 years anniversary of China opening up. So I think there's a lot of common progress that both countries made and the old previous leaders. Now we are getting to the next 40 years. I think in this critical juncture, it's good to look at all those pros and cons and progress made, where are the lessons, and how can we improve that, and also how we can do the research and then to generate the recommendations and the policy.
And according to your research, why China and the U.S. are now facing the danger of trade war at this particular moment? What is the crux?
Well, basically, I think there's quite a few areas. So, first of all, there's a structural reasons. I mean, the U.S. has been, the economy has been, developed in the last, 100 years, and then come to that stage is a lot of manufacturing has been shifted to China. So that's because of the productivity shift. I mean, that's a lot of major old-fashioned, manufacturing actually come to China. That's one reason. Another reason I think U.S. is having U.S. dollars as very strong. I mean, world currency, and that actually helps U.S. to buy a lot of products from China. And also, thirdly, is that the U.S. trade has a surplus with China, but also then it's actually cut surplus with other countries, with other Asian countries, other partners. So China actually took many other parts of the world to contribute to the U.S. In that kind of deficit probably situation. And also, I think another reason is the calculation. You mean the service trade, the tourism, the student movement, and there's a lot of that kind of service trade was not calculated into this kind of trade deficit. So there's many reasons to that. I think also for China too. I mean, when they do the transition, we probably needs to diversify. We shouldn't really just work in one country. Maybe we should have more market, and so there's a lot of reason to be examined to find out. That's our that's why we want to do more research on this subject.
So, Mr. Pillsbury, you also think the trade deficit, which is huge between China and the U.S., is the biggest problem. That's why we have a trade friction.
I think President Trump has said that several times, that the enormous trade deficit is the biggest problem. It's the biggest trade deficit in the world. And as Henry says, we have to find out the origins. This didn't just happen in 1 year. We didn't go from zero balanced trade to 500 billion deficit. It happened very slowly. And it's not clear to me if it was decided by Guoyo Chia, state-owned enterprises. They want to buy European products for some reason, or if it was decided by the government. But that problem has probably 20 years of background. But it's not the only major problem.
What are the others?
Well, technology theft is a big one. Here, President Xi Jinping has several times said he opposes intellectual property theft. He's increased the number of courts, intellectual property courts inside China, increased the number of judges, taken it seriously. But the White House has released these two very long reports with hundreds of examples of either intellectual property theft or what we call forcible technology transfer. And so far, there's no satisfactory answer from Chinese media or Chinese scholars about all these allegations. There's a third area, and it was just investment. China has a so-called negative list that does not accept foreign investment in many, many sectors. This is being reduced as China opens up. But China, speed or rate of opening up, this really affects the trade with the U.S. Also, in Chinese investment in the U.S., there's been many problems that are documented in these reports. So it's not just one problem.
Okay.
President Trump summarizes it all in one word. I don't know if you heard this word.
What is that word?
Reciprocity.
Reciprocity. Yes. Okay, let's talk about those three problems one by one. First of all, the loss of jobs and the trade deficit. According to many Chinese economists, the trade deficit is a structural problem. Basically, is America not saving enough? Basically, is the structural change of the world economy. And also, they have different math. The Chinese say, we actually buy a lot of services from you. You don't count into that. We also buy a lot of stuff from Hong Kong, via Hong Kong and Macau, you don't count into
Right,
that.
that's true.
The natural deficit is not that huge, and it can be solved by us buying more. But it seems the Americans is no mood to talk about that. Is that correct understanding?
That's basically correct. Most economists tend to play down the importance of the deficit. As you said, they think it's some sort of structural problem based on savings rates. However, these economists are not President of the United States.
And they don't have the ears of President Trump.
So President Trump does have an economist with a Harvard PhD in economics advising him that the trade deficit is extremely important. President Trump himself
You're
wrote a
saying
book.
Peter Navarro.
Yes. And President Trump himself didn't get this idea from Peter Navarro. He wrote a book about it almost 20 years ago. He had a long chapter on our biggest challenge in the future will be China, and the biggest problem is the trade deficit. So President Trump's idea of reciprocity is to measure products that are being sold. But Henry makes a very good point. If you count services and investment, things like tourism,
Which the United States is good at.
we don't count it now. When we talk about trade deficit, it means merchandise products trade deficit. But one possibility in our CCG Hudson joint research, we're going to take a look at how do you define a trade deficit. Other countries include services like tourism and investment returns. So we're trying to take a new look at the trade relationship between U.S. and China, and not just look back 40 years, but also look ahead 10 or 20 years with several scenarios. One could be a super trade war scenario.
So you mentioned Peter
one could be more
Navarro.
powerful.
I know that you invited Peter Navarro to
Yes.
Hudson Institute after your trip in Beijing.
Yes.
So have you talked to him about the structural problem? It is not just a trade deficit. There is a reason why there is trade deficit, and it's not necessarily against America's interests.
Yes, I have talked to him, and I have read, he wrote 3 books about China. He doesn't agree. He thinks the trade deficit is extremely damaging to American workers. In fact, he was not a China expert for most of his life. So people ask him, why did you take interest in China? Only in the last few years. He said, my students could not get jobs. They were all unable to join the workforce because China stole all these American jobs. This is his personal observation. But Peter Navarro also has written a lot about intellectual property theft, forcible transfer, and especially the treatment of American companies inside China. So you see how big this problem is. And lots of other people agree with Peter Navarro. He's not all by himself.
President Trump should listen to both sides of the argument? It seems after Gary Cohen and McMaster left the White House, the White House is full of hawkish voices rather than moderates. That's why those aggressive trade policies have been put forward, which is dangerous.
I don't agree. As I mentioned, President Trump had this idea himself in his book, published in the year 2000. Number 2, he does have many voices in the White House. He calls people on the outside. He's known to invite Henry Kissinger to
but
give
only
his
to
views.
those who are with him on his ideas.
No, I would say some American billionaires oppose trade deficit problems, and President Trump talks to them. So he's very open, seeking advice. But the only thing is, he already believed this for almost 20 years. 不是他昨天听到了一个小鸟，那就是
Also recently, you have a senator actually voting against the tariff increase, and also have the congressman wrote letter to President Trump, talking about resume talks with China. So he has other people in the Congress against him as well.
And the problem is those
That's
voices, will they get loud enough from Congress, from business circles? That will force President Trump to think twice about whether he should double down on those aggressive tariff policies.
I think that, first of all, there's a calculation problem. I think the deficit probably was a little bit overstated or exaggerated. But I think the key is now to really have this dialogue. I think government should have dialogue, and the think tank should have dialogue, and we should have communications to explain the situation, and then to really, the media and also the public arena, we should really talk about those, trade issues and also the benefit. And there's also, I think, more to talk about. China, U.S. makes contribution to 40 to 50% of the growth of the economy of the world. If China, U.S. get into trade, the war, it's going to impact not only China, U.S. but also to the world. So it's extremely important to do that. And also, furthermore, I think all the multinationals are now happy about this. They actually air their concerns, and it's also impact the employment back in the United States and also here in China. So I think there's many multifaceted issues that both countries, particularly think tanks, should get together and then find solutions and recommendations. And that's where I think CCTN and Hassan are trying to work on those issues.
But it seems a lot of signals are pointing to the other direction, because the news is that the Americans and the Europeans have struck a deal on zero tariffs on each side, although that is not confirmed yet. They still agree to talk later on about whether to lift tariffs on all products, including agricultural products, which is very important for Europeans. Is this President Trump's tactics to divide and conquer so that he can concentrate on China?
I would say it's possible that a trade war will begin, and then the scholars and think tanks will have to find a chuko, an exit, to stop it. The reason I say the trade war likely will begin is because in China there's too much what I call 阴谋学, conspiracy thinking, that somehow the U.S. is trying to choke 遏制中国的发展, choke off China's development, or there's something behind all this trade issue. But actually, it's not true. The contents of these reports are what it's all about. So if the Chinese side would make some meaningful research on this American case, a lot of it is things Xi Jinping, Tong Shuji would not approve. He wants further opening up. He wants more reform. Many of these American complaints would be solved, or at least reduced, if there were further opening up.
I think
foreign investment.
Suspicion exists on both sides. America also doubt about China's speeding technologies. You also doubt that China wants to play a 100-year marathon to overtake the U.S. as the superpower. Is that the case?
Well, I'm only quoting from Mao Zedong in 1955, that actually the marathon is already going on for more than 70 years. And that China is at least the #2 country in the world. By some statistics, Chinese economy already is #1. So I would say the marathon is a correct and is almost a success for China.
But I wonder whether that marathon has only 2 players. Is that China wants to overtake the U.S. and become a world leader? Many people here in China don't think so.
I know in the Chinese point of view, there's a very bad word called ba, or ba-quan.
Hegemon.
So America, Chinese like to say America is a ba-quan because it's #1 military and economic power. But also Chinese like to say, 我们永远的不会称霸. We Chinese
But you don't believe it. You don't take it as face value.
I think it's a definition of ba. Ba actually is a tyrant, or somebody who doesn't have any dao. And the Chinese belief seems to be, yes, we will be #1 power in the world. But unlike the Americans, we will have virtue, we will have consensus. There's a good example today in China Daily. China's ambassador in London wrote a long op-ed piece, 写得很好, it's very good, about joint common destiny of the whole world. So this is how China sees the future. Not like a ba-quan, like a Meiguo, but more of a virtuous
My question
power.
is, do you believe in the benevolence of a growing power like China? Or do many Americans believe that?
I think Americans like me, at least, we see cooperation as the future. We like to not see a zero-sum game, but I'm not in the majority. A lot of Americans now see China as a threat. A lot of Chinese see America as a threat to China. So if you want to think about a really bad nightmare, it's a trade war from which there's no exit, combined with nationalistic thinking in the military area and the political area. I want to avoid this nightmare, but it may not be possible.
What can be done to avoid this kind of a nightmare, which is the likelihood of which has been increasing, we have to agree. Mr. Wang?
No, I think that it's really, it would be disaster if both countries really go deep into the trade war. And I think China is actually, for its own interest, China has actually pledged to continue to open. That's really very significant. I think President Xi has mentioned at the Boao Forum that China is going to have a high-level opening up, and China has also recently done many acts as well. You know, they reduced auto import tariff by half, and also they have reduced many tariffs in many products as well. And also China has relaxed on ownership of the financial institutions and many other sectors as well. So I think that it's for the China's interest to opening up and to continue to reform. I think it's in the world interest as well, same for the U.S. So the misunderstanding and the mistrust existed now, which is also increasing, is really very bad. So I think we have to solve this misunderstanding and mistrust. You know, if you talk about opening, if you talk about respect intellectual property, you can talk about deeply reform, you talk about reduced tariff, if you talk about global, like President Trump likes global trade alliance now with EU, with Mexico and Canada. So why can't China and U.S. work together on these global trade issues? And I think that we can avoid this kind of trade war, so that I think the think tanks really need now, and also the think tank community of China and U.S. should work together and solve this kind of misunderstanding and mistrust.
I want to get one important aspect of this, a message to the Americans. Probably they don't wrap their minds around, is that China will be the biggest market in the world. We will probably have 600 million middle class next year. And China's consumption is already 70% of the globe, of its own GDP. China will buy a lot and a lot more from America, from Europe.
Right.
Have Americans forgot that?
No. No, in fact, as a solution to the possibility of a trade war, you know, President Xi Jinping has had a very successful campaign against corruption for the last 5 years, including corruption in state-owned enterprises and inside the Communist Party. The list of bad behavior in these two reports, President Xi could say, I agree, I don't want this bad behavior to be carried out by Chinese enterprises or party members. And I think President Xi would be immediately respected and obeyed. So my hope is these documents are really written only for one person, Xi Jinping himself.
But when you look at the 10 demands from the U.S. delegation, when they come to Beijing, when we go to Washington, it sounds like they're asking China to capitulate, to kowtow to the U.S. demands. You have to drop $100 billion of tariffs in the first year, and then another $100 billion next year. You have to restructure your economy, no national subsidy. You have to stop Made in China 2025. All these demands sounds like China has to capitulate.
That's what your media said after the, actually it was eight
You're saying these
points.
are not the demands.
They were not demands. They're called the 8 points. And your side leaked them to the media, and then somebody else leaked them to Bloomberg. So everybody can read these 8 points. They're descriptions of problems. They're not negotiating demands. But I think Chinese side was not willing to make any kind of offer, on the 8 points.
But
that's why today we have no negotiations.
What is the offer that will satisfy Americans? There are several Reduce trade deficit?
Well, there's only,
Stop Made
there's
in
only
China
one
2025?
American. There's only one American to satisfy, President Trump.
But who?
This is his personal leadership, and
We'll
he cares a
talk to
lot
him.
about this.
And what are the exact terms that President Trump will accept as a truce?
So far, President Trump has only done two things. He released the 8 points that are general description of what should be U.S.-China trade relations. And number two, he issued these White House reports based on testimony, internal Chinese documents, like the subsidies for 2025. There's a long description of internal Chinese documents about how that would be done. One of the 8 points said, please don't have illegal subsidies of the 2025 plan.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope there will be actual negotiations. But so far, I think it's just exchanging kind of long-term thinking about what both sides hope.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Wang. Thank you, Mr. Pillsbury. And tomorrow, we will air part 2 of our talks with Mr. Pillsbury and Mr. Wang on trade relations between China and the United States.